the city of Boston does not slow down for anyone, not for the rain, not for the cold, not for the 200 people gathered on the 18th floor of the Harrington Grand, raise Crystal Saskas toward a $750 million future they believe is already theirs. Wide shot the skyline at night, glass and steel and light, stretching in every direction like a promise the city made to itself a long time ago and has been keeping ever since. Closer now, one building among many, gold light behind tall windows, the shape of a party, silhouettes moving, music bleeding through the glass, the particular glow of a room that has decided it matters. Slur, still a single window, 18th floor, a man standing alone looking down, navy suit, plain watch, hands in his pockets. Performing, not waiting to be noticed, just watching. Below him the city moves, above him the party continues. And somewhere between those two worlds, something is about to happen that no one in that ballroom is ready for, except him. He already knows how the night ends.
Room 18-4. Harrington Grand Hotel, 7:42 p.m. The night someone poured wine on Calvin Mercer in front of 200 people was the night they made the most expensive mistake of their lives. They just didn't know it yet. Calvin stood at the window of room 1804 at the Harrington Grand, 18 floors up. The city moved below him the way it always did, without asking permission, without waiting. Just moving relentlessly, in every direction at once, like it had somewhere important to be and couldn't be bothered to explain where. He had been watching it for 11 minutes, not because he was nervous. Calvin Mercer had not been nervous before a meeting in a very long time. He watched the city because it was honest, because cities, unlike people, did not pretend to be something they weren't. They just were, loud and bright and indifferent and completely themselves. He respected that. On the nightstand, a single black card with a silver seal and a serial number in the bottom right corner. No name printed on it, no title, just the number which meant something to exactly the people it needed to mean something to, and nothing to anyone else. That was the point. He picked it up, put it in his breast pocket, then he picked up the watch. A Timex, plain face, worn leather strap replaced twice in 15 years because the watch itself had never needed replacing. It had belonged to his grandfather, Gerald Mercer, for 40 years before it belonged to Calvin. Gerald had worn it to work every single day, to the loading dock, to the overnight shifts, to the early mornings when the rest of the city was still dark and Gerald was already moving. Gerald Mercer had never been late once in his life, not once. Calvin fastened the watch around his wrist. Left hand, 2 fingers of space, never too tight. The way Gerald had shown him when Calvin was 7 years old and had asked why Grandpa always wore the same watch when other men wore nice ones. Gerald had said, "A man who needs his watch to announce him hasn't figured out yet that he's the one doing the announcing." Calvin had been 7. He'd nodded the way children nod at things they don't understand yet and spend the rest of their lives learning. He was 41 now. He understood. A knock at the door, soft, precise. "Mr. Mercer." Prescott's voice through the wood. Steady, as always. Prescott had been with him for 3 years and had developed, in that time, the particular competence of someone who understood that his job was to make problems disappear before they became problems. "Car's ready when you are." Calvin checked the Timex, looked out the window one more time. "Tell them I'm walking," he said. A pause, brief. The pause of a man who has learned that arguing with Calvin Mercer is a perfectly efficient way to waste both their time. "Sir, it's 14 blocks the gala starts at. Then I have exactly enough time." Calvin was already moving toward the door. "Go ahead. Find me inside." "Yes, sir." He stepped into the hallway, let the door fall shut behind him. 14 blocks, November air. The city doing what cities do. That was enough. He did not take the elevator. He took the stairs to the lobby, which was a habit from years ago that had become something he didn't think about anymore. The stairs were quieter. You could think on stairs. You could arrive at the bottom already knowing what you were going to do, instead of stepping out of an elevator still deciding. Tonight he already knew. He had known for 6 weeks. Streets of Boston, 7:44 p.m. to 8:12 p.m. Loisua, Them Wun Von Bando Crestline Capital. They kagzindat merita len one. The ordinary sounds of len one. The night air found the back of his neck immediately. Good sharp. The kind of cold that clarifies, that makes a clear argument for being awake and alive and standing on ground that isn't going anywhere. He walked south on Clarendon, then west. The city opened around him in layers. The restaurant block, with its warm light, and the smell of garlic and good bread coming through propped doors, the quieter stretch after that where a laundromat steamed against its own windows, and a woman in a green coat waited for a bus with the focused patience of someone who has done this 10,000 times and made peace with every one of them. The block before the Harrington Grand, where the hotels stood shoulder to shoulder and valets moved in their practiced choreography. He thought about the audit. 112 pages, 6 weeks in his possession. He had read it 3 times, once for the numbers, once for the patterns inside the numbers, once for what the patterns said about the people who had built them. The picture was not ambiguous. Apex Meridian was not a healthy company wearing a sick company's clothes. The offshore buffers, the reclassified liabilities, the systematic inflation of quarterly projections, this was not accounting error. This was accounting architecture, built deliberately, maintained deliberately, by people who understood exactly what it was doing, and Calvin had seen this architecture before. Not in a textbook, not in a case study from a business school that cost more per semester than his mother had made in a year. In a different building, 15 years ago, when the architecture had a different company's name on it. When he had been the one who found it and documented it and handed it to people who had decided, for their own reasons, that they would rather have rid of him than deal with what he'd found. He had spent the 2 years after his termination doing something that most people in his position did not do. He had not retreated. He had not taken the first job available to put distance between himself and the humiliation of the cardboard box. He had gone to a mentor, a man named Aldous Webb, who had run a small private equity operation in Philadelphia for 30 years and who had seen enough of the world to recognize something in Calvin worth backing, and he had made a case. Not for charity, for investment, in a specific thesis about patient capital and overlooked value, backed by the 37 pages of analysis that had cost him his job, and that turned out, in Aldous Webb's hands, to be exactly the kind of documented structural thinking that serious money paid attention to. Aldous had put in the first 2 million. Calvin had made it into 9 in 4 years. From 9, Crestline Capital had been built over the following 11 years, with the specific discipline of a man who had learned at 26 that institutions failed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked honesty. And that the people willing to be honest, willing to look at the actual numbers and say the actual thing, were rarer than the market understood. That rarity was, it turned out, worth a great deal. He was not walking into this gala to settle anything. He had made his peace, the practical kind, the kind that converts grievance into information, with what had happened to him at 26. You did not build what he had built by spending energy on old scores. You built it by understanding what the scores told you about how the world actually worked. And then working accordingly. He was walking into this gala because of 3,000 people. Analysts, accountants, facilities staff, people who came in early and stayed late and sent their kids to decent schools because the salary was reliable. People who had no idea that the company beneath their feet had a foundation someone had been quietly patching for years, and who deserved, not as a matter of charity but as a matter of basic accountability, to have someone paying attention to what happened to them when the foundation stopped holding. The deal Calvin had structured through Crestline Capital was real. The need was real. He had been willing to sign, was technically still willing with conditions, but he wanted to see Douglas Hale first. In person, without the architecture of boardrooms and attorneys and prepared remarks. Just 2 men at an event, one of whom didn't know the other was watching. Call it due diligence. Call it the specific habit of a man who had learned in the rain at 26 that documents told you what companies did. Watching people told you who they were. He rounded the last corner. The Harrington Grand blazed ahead. Gold light through glass doors, valeters in their practiced rush, the murmur of an orchestra warming up somewhere inside. Women in evening gowns, men in tuxedos, the particular energy of a room that had decided it was significant. Calvin straightened his collar. Walked through the front entrance. Harrington Grand Ballroom, 8:14 p.m. to 9:31 p.m. The security guard's name tag said Jerome. Mid-40s. Built like someone who had played football and let his body keep the memory. He looked at Calvin with the expression of a man doing rapid mental arithmetic. Navy suit, no bow tie, no entourage, no visible reason to be at the front entrance of a private gala, and came up with an answer he was fairly confident about. He stepped slightly to the side, not fully blocking, the professional version of a wall. "Sir, this is a private event." Calvin reached into his breast pocket, produced the card, held it out without hurry. Jerome looked at the card. At the serial number, at Calvin, then he stepped aside. "My apologies," he said, stiff. The particular embarrassment of someone who has just recalculated and doesn't love where the new number lands. Calvin nodded once and walked through. No lecture, no explanation, no performance. Because the most useless sentence in the English language, spoken always by people who suspect the answer is no, is "Do you know who I am?" And Calvin had never once said it. Not at 26, not at 30, not now. Inside, the ballroom opened like a held breath released. Crystal chandeliers casting light in every direction. White tablecloths, centerpieces that cost more than some people's monthly rent. The string quartet in the far corner playing something that everyone was too busy performing to actually hear. And phones everywhere, horizontal, recording, documenting attendance at this particular event, because apparently it hadn't happened if nobody had footage. On the presentation screens cycling across every wall, the Apex Meridian logo, clean and blue, and beneath it the number that had brought everyone here. $750 million partnership announcement this evening. The room buzzed with the particular frequency of people in proximity to large sums of money. Calvin moved through it slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes moving. He had a gift or a practiced habit which amounted to the same thing, for being invisible in rooms like this. Not because he was forgettable, because he was still, and in a room where everyone was performing at full volume, stillness read as wrong. As out of place, as staff, he had watched this happen his entire adult life. Two women in sequin dresses shifted their clutch bags to their far hands as he passed. A reflex, unconscious probably, which somehow made it more complete than if it had been deliberate. A man at the bar turned, clocked Calvin, turned back with the small recalibration of someone who had decided in under a second that this particular person was not worth the social investment. The man then laughed too loudly at something his companion said, as if to demonstrate to no one in particular that he had better things to attend to. A server, young, moving fast, keeping a tray of champagne level through what looked like sheer determination, caught Calvin's eye for a half second and gave him a look of brief, exhausted solidarity. "Us," said the look, "versus all of this." Calvin smiled at her. She blinked, then smiled back, surprised by it. He ordered water at the bar, found a column near the far edge of the room, close enough to see the stage, far enough to be precisely what everyone had already decided he was. Background nobody. A shadow in a room full of people angling for the light. Perfect. He saw Douglas Hale before Douglas Hale saw him. The photographs had been accurate, tall, silver-templed, the particular handsomeness that comes from good genetics reinforced by decades of certainty that every room was already his. He worked the space with the ease of someone raised to be watched, hand extended here, laugh calibrated there, the smooth choreography of a man who had been performing confidence for so long it had stopped being a performance and become simply who he was. Beside him, Renata Hale, 49 years old. Gold dress, red mouth, posture so exact it looked engineered. She moved through the room with the particular awareness of a woman who had been watching and being watched simultaneously for a long time. Her eyes moved in a pattern, not random, not social, but purposeful, categorizing, sorting, running the continuous calculation of who mattered, who didn't, and what each person in the room could do for or to her position. Her eyes found Calvin 2 seconds, maybe less, and finished their calculation, not a guest, not relevant, not worth the processing. She looked away. Calvin brought his water to his lips. There it is, he thought, not angrily, just clearly. The way you acknowledge a fact that you had hoped would be different and are not surprised to find unchanged. He had wanted to walk in here and discover that 15 years and a rebranding had produced something genuinely different. That the culture had shifted, that leadership had learned something from what the old company had done and who it had been. One look from Renata Hale, sorting people at a glance like library cards, filing Calvin under irrelevant without a moment's consideration. Not the answer he'd hoped for, but the honest one. He stayed where he was, finished his water, watched the room. Because conclusions drawn from one data point are opinions, and Calvin Mercer did not deal in opinions. He waited for confirmation. Douglas arrived approximately 20 minutes later, not because Calvin had moved. He hadn't. But the crowd had shifted and thinned near the column, and Calvin was slightly more visible than he'd intended, and Douglas Hale was, as Calvin had already noted, a man who kept extremely close track of who was standing in his space. He came over with a smile assembled from quality components that didn't quite combine into warmth. "Sir," the word carrying significant freight. "Are you finding everything all right?" His tone said, "You shouldn't be standing here." His face said, "I am too polished to say that directly." Calvin kept his voice easy. "Fine, just observing." Douglas let the words sit between them. Then, almost lazily, he snapped his fingers at a passing server. Not looking at her, the gesture of a man who has never once considered that the person holding the tray has a name. "Get him something, a towel." A small pause, a smaller smile. "He looks warm." A few nearby guests looked over. The server stopped, uncertain. Calvin said nothing. Douglas moved away, satisfied with the exchange in the particular way of a man who needed an audience more than he needed a result. The mockery had not really been about Calvin at all. It had been a performance of dominance for whoever was paying attention. Interesting, Calvin thought. And unfortunate. Renata arrived 4 minutes later, heels precise on marble, the rhythm of someone who understood that how you moved through a space told people what you thought of it. She was carrying a glass of red wine she had collected from a passing tray without glancing at the person who carried it. She looked at Calvin the way you look at something left in the wrong place by someone who should have known better. "You know," she said, pleasantly enough, "if you needed work tonight, there was a sign-up process." She tilted her head. "You didn't have to try to blend in." Calvin looked at her. She extended the wine glass toward his chest. "Take this to table 3, they've been waiting." He didn't move. Something shifted in her expression. Not uncertainty, annoyance. The specific annoyance of someone whose instructions have been ignored by a person they've already categorized. "Excuse me," she said, slower now. "I asked you to. I heard you." His voice quiet, entirely level. The voice of a man for whom other people's ceilings stopped being relevant a long time ago. The annoyance sharpened. Douglas reappeared. Because of course he had been watching. This had been a collaboration from the beginning. Renata identifying the target, Douglas arriving for the closing performance. Calvin understood that now. Douglas plucked the wine glass from Renata's hand with the ease of a man used to being handed things. He looked at Calvin and then, slowly, clearly, in front of 200 people in various states of attention, he tilted the glass forward. The red wine hit Calvin's suit at the shoulder, cold first, then the warmth of room temperature wine spreading through navy fabric in the way that only red wine spreads. Total, immediate, complete. The sound that moved through the room was not quite a gasp. It was the thing that exists just before a gasp, when people aren't yet sure if they're allowed to react. "One less confused worker ruining the atmosphere," Douglas said. Light, easy, like he'd just made a mildly clever observation. Renata laughed. Soft under her breath, the laugh of someone who has just received confirmation that her read of a situation was correct. 4 feet to Calvin's left, someone raised their phone, recording. Calvin stood very still for a moment. He thought about his grandfather. Gerald Mercer, who had spent 40 years on loading docks and overnight shifts, and never once needed a room to confirm what he already knew about himself. He thought about his mother, Rita Mercer, who had cleaned other people's rooms at Johns Hopkins Memorial for 28 years, and who had come home every morning with the particular quiet dignity of a woman who had decided, somewhere early in her life, that other people's opinions of her were simply not her responsibility to manage. Calvin Mercer, who owned Crestline Capital outright, who held positions in 19 companies across 7 sectors, who had built everything he had from a cardboard box and a rainy afternoon and a decision made in the wet, lifted 2 fingers. He wiped the edge of his jaw where a drop had landed, adjusted his sleeve, straightened his posture, and walked toward the exit. No words, no backward glance, no performance, just a man who knew exactly who he was, leaving a room that had just demonstrated exactly who it was. A server, the young one with the tray, the one who had given him the look of exhausted solidarity, whispered as he passed. That man walked out like he owned the place. She meant it as an observation. She had no idea how precisely accurate it was. Corridor outside the ballroom, 9:31 p.m. The hallway was a different country. Kula Kuita. The marble held the sound of the city outside in a low, continuous hum. The music from the ballroom softened to a murmur through the closed doors, like something heard from underwater. Calvin's footsteps were even. 1, 2, 3. The stain on his shoulder pulled slightly against the fabric. He didn't touch it, didn't look at it. It was there. It was what it was. No amount of attention would make it less true, and no amount of pretending would make it less visible, and he had made peace with both of those facts before he had even reached the corridor. He pulled out his phone, screen lighting his face in the dim hall. He found Prescott's contact, tapped it. Prescott answered on the second ring, which was standard. "Sir, pull the offer." Calvin kept walking, voice steady, completely unhurried, as if he were commenting on the temperature. "Lock every channel. Full termination. Process it tonight. A single beat." Just long enough for Prescott to absorb the full meaning of full termination. Not a pause, not a renegotiation, not a cooling-off period. Complete and formal withdrawal from every associated position. "Understood," Prescott said. "Timeline. Now." "Yes, sir." He ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. A couple near the elevator at the end of the hall had seen him come through the ballroom doors. He could tell by the way their attention moved to the stain on his shoulder before it moved to his face. The involuntary prioritizing of visible information. The woman murmured something. The man shook his head slowly. "Rich people never expect the quiet ones," the man said. Just loud enough to be heard, not quite intending it. Calvin pressed the elevator button. He gave them a single nod. Not unfriendly, not warm, just acknowledged. The doors opened. He stepped in. In the mirrored walls of the elevator, he looked at himself, steady eyes, even jaw, the dark stain spreading across navy fabric in the way that things spread when they've gone as far as they're going. His phone vibrated. Prescott, legal conf, all channels initiating, announcement to partners within the hour. He locked the screen. The elevator opened to the lobby. It moved the way lobbies move at events like this, clusters of guests stepping out for air or a quieter phone call. The general restlessness of people who need to perform being at a party more than they need to actually be at it. Someone near the bar noticed the stain and said something to their companion. He caught that's the guy from somewhere to his left. He didn't slow down. Outside the Harrington Grand, 9:38 p.m. The night was sharp with cold, the good kind. The kind that finds the back of your neck and makes a clear argument for being alive and awake and standing on solid ground. A valet moved toward him immediately, trained already reaching for the standard protocol. Calvin lifted one hand. "Easy, final." "I'm walking." The valet stopped. "Of course, sir." Calvin stepped off the curb, crossed the driveway, reached the sidewalk beyond the hotel's gold-lit perimeter, and kept going. Behind him, through the glass, the ballroom lights were still warm, music still playing, the Apex Meridian logo still spinning on every screen. $750 million partnership announcement. He almost smiled. He walked half a block, past a bodega with its door propped against its own warmth. Past a bus stop where a woman in scrubs sat reading something on her phone with the focused calm of someone who has genuinely earned the right to be exactly where she is. He thought about his mother. Rita Mercer had taken that same bus, or one like it, for 28 years. She had risen at 4 in the afternoon, made coffee that she drank standing at the kitchen counter because there wasn't time to sit, packed her bag, and gone to work at Johns Hopkins Memorial in the part of the building that most people never thought about. The rooms where things got cleaned, where the particular invisible labor of keeping a hospital functional happened without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without a single spinning logo on a screen. She had never complained. Not that he heard, and Calvin had listened carefully. She had also never once suggested in word or implication that the work made her less than what she was. She had been Rita Mercer, completely, durably, without apology, whether she was in her uniform or her Sunday clothes or the gardening clothes she wore on Saturday mornings, when she moved through her small backyard with the particular ownership of a woman in the one space that was entirely hers. He thought about what she had told him once, when he was 10 years old and had come home undone by something he couldn't even name now. Some cruelty from a classmate, some small humiliation that had felt enormous in the way that things feel enormous at 10. She had looked at him steadily, had not rushed to fix it or minimize it, had waited until he was done being upset about it, and then said, "You are not what other people put down in front of you, Calvin. You are what you do when you pick back up." He had been nodded. He was 41. He He was walking, his phone vibrated. Prescott again. Announcement delivered. 3 associated funds confirmed withdrawal pending documentation. 4th processing, on schedule. And then a forwarded message through Prescott's routing line from a number Calvin didn't recognize. Who is that man? Something just happened in that ballroom. People are talking. Calvin stopped walking. He was at the corner of Clement and 5th. A streetlight made a warm circle on the pavement. Traffic moved past, indifferent and continuous. He looked back once. The Harrington Grand was a gold rectangle in the middle distance. Even from here, or maybe especially from here, he could see something different in the quality of light through the windows. A change in the movement of people inside, less festive, more urgent. His phone vibrated a 3rd time. Prescott announcement delivered. Also, someone was filming tonight. A journalist, apparently. She was in the room. Calvin read that twice. A journalist. He hadn't accounted for that. It didn't change the decisions. Everything was already in motion. Channels locked. Withdrawal underway, the legal mechanism turning steadily forward like something that had been wound tight for a very long time and finally released. But a journalist meant a different clock, a faster one, a clock that other people would be able to read. He stood another moment on the corner. The city moved around him the way it always had. Without asking, without waiting, without arranging itself around any individual person's need for things to pause. A couple laughed across the street. A car played music too loud for 9:38 on a weeknight. A window lit up on the 4th floor of a building across the way. Someone arriving home or waking up, or simply deciding the dark had gone on long enough. He thought about a woman on her hands and knees in a hotel ballroom, 60-something years old, evening shift uniform. Picking up broken glass by herself. Carefully, methodically, the way you do a job you've done 10,000 times. While 200 people raised their glasses overhead and congratulated each other on their significance. He had stopped. He had crouched down beside her, had helped her pick up every piece without a word exchanged between them. She had looked at him when they were done, clear eyes, the unsentimental kind of gratitude that comes from someone who expects very little from strangers, and had given him a small nod. He had given one back, that was the moment. Not the whine on his shoulder, not Douglas's smile or Renata's laugh or the server's whisper about owning the place. The moment had been a woman picking up glass alone while the party raged above her, and the simple, clarifying question it asked. What does it tell you about a company when the people who keep it standing have to kneel on its floors alone? He knew the answer, had known it since he was 26 years old with 37 pages of truth that no one wanted. The question was always who was going to do something about it. He put his hands in his pockets and walked on. Behind him, he did not turn to watch, but he knew the music inside the Harrington Grand stopped mid-note. He kept walking. Some things you set in motion because they're right, and then you walk away, and you trust the work. And the night moves with you, and you don't look back, because the past is fixed, and you have places to be. Hale residence, Beacon Hill, 10:17 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. Douglas Hale did not sleep, not because he felt guilty. Guilt requires a particular kind of self-awareness that takes time to build, and Douglas had spent 52 years constructing very effective walls against self-awareness. Walls that looked like confidence, walls that looked like leadership, walls that looked like a gold-trimmed ballroom and a $750 million deal, and a wife in a gold dress who knew exactly how to make a room feel like it belonged to them both. He didn't sleep because his phone wouldn't stop. It started at 10:17 p.m. A text from his CFO, 3 sentences, each shorter than the last, as if the situation were burning off the man's capacity for complete thoughts. Then his COO, then 2 board members in quick succession, their messages carrying that specific quality of alarm that people produce when they understand something is wrong but not yet how wrong. By midnight, Douglas had 43 unread messages and a scotch he'd poured at 11 that he still hadn't touched. By 1 a.m., Apex Meridian's after-hours stock movement had been flagged by 2 financial monitoring services. By 2 a.m., the clip had been viewed by 900,000 people. By 3 a.m., 3 board members had called his personal number. One had left a voicemail that Douglas listened to once, and then set his phone face down on the kitchen island, as if putting distance between himself and the device might put distance between himself and what was on it. By 4 a.m., 2 board members had resigned. Not by call, by email. The particular cowardice of resignation by email, the way it allowed the sender to avoid the sound of another person's voice receiving bad news, had always irritated Douglas when other people did it. He sat at the kitchen island in a white dress shirt with the collar open. The island was white marble, kept spotless by a woman who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and whose name Douglas could not at this moment have produced under any pressure. The kitchen was immaculate, the scotch was untouched, the phone was face down, and Douglas Hale sat in the center of all of it and tried very hard not to think about the man in the navy suit. Because when he thought about the man in the navy suit, the way he had stood there, the particular quality of his stillness, the fact that he had not flinched, had not explained himself, had not done any of the things a person does when they are surprised or embarrassed or caught in a place they don't belong. When Douglas thought about all of that, something cold and specific moved through him. He had been in boardrooms for 30 years. He knew how power looked. Power looked like the room noticing you. Power looked like space being made. Power looked loud and deliberate and fully aware of its own effect on the people around it. The man in the navy suit had done none of that, and Douglas, who was very good at reading rooms, had missed him entirely. "What else have you missed?" said a voice in the back of his mind. He didn't answer it. Renata came downstairs at 4:30 a.m. She had changed from the gold dress into something dark and silk. Her face, without the full evening presentation, was different, not diminished, just real. Which was its own distinct difference. She looked at him the way she looked at problems, directly, without the preliminary of softening it. She looked at the untouched scotch, at the face-down phone, at Douglas. "How bad?" she said. Not a question, the shape of a question with all the hope removed. Douglas turned the phone over, slid it across the marble toward her. She looked at the screen, scrolled, stopped, scrolled again. "The clip," Douglas said, "it's at. I can see what it's at." She set the phone down, turned it face down the same way he had. Like neither of them wanted to watch the number move in real time. The kitchen was very quiet. "We need to reach him," Renata said. "I know. Today. In person. Not through lawyers, not through assistants." "I know, Renata." She looked at him a moment longer, something moving behind her eyes that she kept behind her eyes, which was where Renata Hale kept most things that mattered. Then she turned and went back upstairs. Douglas sat alone in the immaculate kitchen. He thought about the man's posture. The way he had adjusted his sleeve after the wine hit, slowly, without agitation, as if rearranging something minor. The way he had walked toward the exit without looking back, without hurrying, without any of the energy of a man who has just been humiliated. The way he had walked, Douglas thought now, like someone who had already made a decision before he reached the door. "What decision?" said the voice in the back of his mind. Douglas picked up his phone, called his CFO. It went to voicemail. Of course it did. Elaine Voss's kitchen, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Elaine Voss had not intended to break a story. She had intended to write 500 words about the Apex Meridian Gala for a regional business journal that had been paying her 40 cents a word for 11 years. She had attended 300 events like it, had drunk bad champagne at 250 of them, had watched wealthy people congratulate each other on their wealth at all 300 without finding any of it worth more than the standard half-column treatment. But 38 seconds of video had a way of reorganizing your sense of what constituted a story. She was at her kitchen table at 6 a.m. with her reading glasses on and her third coffee going cold beside her laptop. 17 browser tabs open. The clip sitting in the center tab paused at the frame where Calvin Mercer wiped his jaw with 2 fingers before adjusting his sleeve. The clip was at 1 million views, which meant that by the time most people on the eastern seaboard finished breakfast, it would be pushing 2. Her caption had been simple. She had written it at 11 p.m., slightly shaken, still at the table in the ballroom, surrounded by the noise of whatever had just broken loose around her. She hadn't tried to be profound. She had just written what she'd seen, because that was the job. Watched something tonight I can't stop thinking about. They poured a glass of wine on him. He walked out like the building was his. Maybe it was. Her inbox had 231 new messages. In 31 years of journalism, Elaine Voss had never had 231 messages before sunrise. She read through them with the methodical attention of someone who had learned, over 3 decades, that the signal is always buried inside the noise, and the noise is always louder, and the only way through is patience. Most were reactions, outrage, solidarity, the specific collective anger of people who recognize something they've experienced themselves. This happened to my husband. This happened to my father at his own company's Christmas party. This happened to me every single day for 6 years until I stopped showing up. And then 16 messages deep, one from a name she recognized immediately. Robert Gale, 67 years old, former editor-in-chief of a publication that had at its peak set the agenda for American business journalism. Semi-retired now, or so he said, though what that meant in practice was that he had traded the editorial chair for a byline and was currently writing a series on systemic bias in American corporate culture that had been quietly accumulating an audience among readers who had stopped believing the subject was being covered honestly. She and Robert had worked together for 4 years, 20 years ago. She had been a junior reporter. He had been the editor who read her copy as if it mattered, which was rarer than it should be. They had stayed in loose contact since. The occasional email, the annual lunch when he was in Boston, the particular professional warmth of two people who respect each other's work without needing to be in each other's lives. His message was 5 sentences. Elaine, I've been following the clip since midnight. I think you may have filmed the moment I've been trying to find for 2 years. I know something about that invitation card. Call me. She called him before she finished reading it. He answered before the second ring. The serial number on that card, he said, without greeting, without warm-up, because Robert Gale had always treated time as the genuinely finite resource it was. I had a source pull the guest manifest for principal partner invitations. There are 6 names on that list. I've placed 5 of them from the event photographs. A deliberate pause. Robert had always known exactly how to time a pause. The 6th is registered to Crestline Capital. Elaine set down her coffee. Pull the ownership structure, he said. She was already typing. She found it. Read it. Read it again. Robert, she said slowly. Yes, this man. Yes, they poured wine. On, yes, Elaine, the kitchen held that for a moment. I'm writing it, she said. I know you are. A pause. I'm writing the context. Let's do it properly. Let's do it right. She hung up, opened a new document, put her glasses back on and began, not the fast version. Not the clip with a caption. The real version, the one that required 6 hours and 17 sources, and the kind of careful verification that meant she would have to call people who didn't want to be called, and ask questions that people didn't want to answer. The version that would stand up completely to every scrutiny. The version that Robert's 2 years of reporting had been building toward without knowing it needed a moment, and that this moment needed without knowing it needed a story. She wrote. The city came up around her as she worked, light changing in the kitchen window, the sounds of the building waking, footsteps overhead, a door, a radio through the wall playing something she couldn't quite identify. She didn't stop. She had a discipline that had been built over 31 years and a story that had been built over 15, even if neither she nor the man at the center of it had known it at the time. She wrote, Crestline Capital offices, 8:15 a.m. to 2 p.m. Loisua. Tai kijk ziendao mer Rita len tu. Kat bert bani người doi tên every meridian fund sur kain cơ so hom lap part 1. Calvin was at his desk by 7. Not because the situation required early hours. Prescott had the legal mechanism running. The associated funds were processing their withdrawals with the steady institutional efficiency of money doing what it's properly instructed to do. The situation did not need him in the building before sunrise. He was there because he wanted to read page 47 again. The summary section. The page where the numbers stopped being numbers and became a portrait of choices, who had made them, when, with what knowledge of their consequences. He had read this page 6 times in 6 weeks. He read it a 7th, not because he doubted what it said, but because decisions with the weight of this one deserved to be made from the document itself, not from memory of the document. It said exactly what he remembered. He closed the file. His office was a corner room on the 16th floor. Prescott had arranged it 3 years ago when they took the space, and Calvin had not seen a reason to change it. The windows faced north and east. Outside, the city held itself under November overcast, everything under it sharp and particular, the kind of light that finds the details in things. He looked at the details. His phone had been active since before 6. Prescott's updates arriving in sequence. The legal mechanism was processing, the stock movement had been flagged, 2 board members had resigned by email overnight. Calvin had read each update and set the phone face down and gone back to page 47. Now he set the page down and thought about what came next. Not the filing that was already drafted, reviewed, verified. 5 weeks of preparation. A document that did not leave gaps because the people who built it understood that gaps were where truth went to get lost. The filing would go through at 4:30 p.m. regardless of anything that happened between now and then. That was decided. What was not decided was what happened to the work. He picked up the organizational chart, below director level. He had asked Prescott for it at 2 o'clock the previous night, from the street outside the Harrington Grand, and it had been on his desk when he arrived at 7. 2,300 names, arranged by division, by function, by the particular architecture of a company that had real operational value buried inside a leadership structure that had been systematically deceiving its investors. The people on this chart had not built the deception. They had built the actual company, the mid-market analytics platform, the compliance consulting arm, the regional advisory teams that had genuine client relationships and genuine track records and genuine hen value that would survive whatever happened to the entity above them. If someone was paying attention to what could be preserved and how. He was paying attention. Prescott knocked at 8:15, came in with the clip count, the board resignations, the stock movement in after hours. 2.4 million views as of 7:30, Prescott said, setting the summary on the desk. After hours down 22%. Board Chair Harriet Cross has not resigned. Her statement went out at 6. Concern, commitment to review, no names. What's your read on Cross? Calvin said. Prescott considered it the way he considered things that were worth considering without rushing. 8 years on the board, he said, survived 2 previous leadership crises without getting ahead of herself or behind the situation. She understands the difference between the institution and the people running it. She's been waiting for room to act. He paused. I think she has it now. Calvin looked at the stock figure. And the calls, he said, Douglas Hale's office 4 times since 6. His personal attorney twice, a Gerald Finch, 1 board member, not Cross. Prescott checked his notes and Elaine Voss. The journalist who was in the room last night, she left a message through the public line. What did she say? That she filmed something last night she doesn't fully understand yet, and she would like to understand it before she publishes. A pause, she specifically said before, not instead of. A journalist asking to understand something before putting it into the world. Rarer than it should be. Tell her I'm not available for comment, Calvin said, but tell her thank you for asking. Those exact words. Yes, sir. Prescott made a note. The Hales themselves haven't called directly. They will. What would you like me to tell them? Calvin turned to the window. The city going about its Thursday with complete indifference to any of this. Traffic, people, the ordinary relentless forward motion of a place that did not stop for individual situations. Nothing yet, he said. Let them sit with it. Prescott moved toward the door. The slight pause at the threshold, the hesitation that meant something worth saying had not yet been said. Go ahead, Calvin said. The accounting structure, Prescott said carefully, on page 47. It's the same methodology Hargrove Financial used before the SEC action. He paused. Did Douglas know that when he inherited it? Calvin turned from the window, looked at Prescott directly. That, he said, is the question I intend to have answered this afternoon. Prescott held the look for a moment. Then nodded. Then left. Calvin sat with the question the empty room left behind. Because there were 2 versions of Douglas Hale, and they led to different places. Not in the legal sense. Both versions were accountable under the filing that would go out at 4:30 regardless, but in the human sense. The version who had inherited a corrupted system and continued it knowingly was one kind of person. The version who had inherited it told himself the restructuring had cleaned it up and continued it through a combination of incuriosity and the particular blindness of a man who needed things to be fine. That was a different kind of person. Both kinds made a mess. Only one kind had any chance of understanding it. He picked up the org chart again. Went back to the work of finding what could be saved and how. Hale Residence, Beacon Hill, 8:43 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. Renata did not wait. while Douglas made calls that went to voicemail and sent messages that received automated responses and tried to navigate a collapsing situation through the standard channels that had stopped being useful approximately 12 hours ago. Renata sat in the study on the second floor with her laptop and her reading glasses, and the particular focused energy of a woman that information is the only currency that loses value, that never loses value regardless of what the market does. She was looking for Calvin Mercer, methodically, starting with the obvious and moving steadily toward the obscure, the way you search when you already suspect the obvious won't be enough. No Forbes profile, no Bloomberg entry, no Wikipedia, no LinkedIn, no Instagram, no public-facing anything. A few indirect mentions in institutional finance publications, background investor unnamed source, quiet position, all with the same careful removal from any spotlight. The man had built his privacy the way he had presumably built everything else, deliberately over a long period of time, without announcing what he was doing. She found the Crestline Capital filings, which told her the structural facts without telling her anything about the person. She found a brief mention in a 2017 Harvard Business Review piece about Shin Capital. He was cited anonymously as a fund manager who had held positions in distressed companies for longer than the market would expect and had been correct to do so. She found a reference in a 2021 commercial real estate report to a Crestline subsidiary that had quietly acquired and stabilized 2 properties that had been in default. Patient, quiet, correct over long time horizons, she kept looking, and then, in the digital archive of a business ethics conference held in Chicago in the fall of 2019, she found it. A transcript. Speaker listed as C. Mercer, Crestline Capital. The talk had been titled, "What Companies Lose When They Stop Seeing People." She read it once fast, scanning, then she closed the laptop, sat back, opened it again, and read it from the beginning. Slowly. The way you read something when you realize, part way through, that it is going to require your full attention. It was not a polished speech, no TED Talk cadence, no inspirational architecture, no moments designed for applause. It was direct in the way that things are direct when the person saying them has stopped trying to make the thinking comfortable for the audience and started trying to make it true. He talked about the invisible cost of disrespect in corporate cultures, not the legal liability, not the reputational risk. The human cost, the accumulated weight of small moments, the eye rolls and the interrupted sentences and the names not retained and the contributions attributed to someone who hadn't contributed, that hollowed out people who could have made organizations extraordinary. He talked about it not as a social issue, but as a business failure, a structural one, the kind that didn't show up on any quarterly report until it was too late to address. He said, "The most expensive thing a company can do is make its people feel like furniture, not because of what they'll say when they leave, because of what they stop doing while they're still there. You lose that, the discretionary effort, the creative investment, the belief that the work matters, and you lose everything eventually. You just won't see it on this quarter's numbers. You'll see it in 3 years, or 5, when you're trying to understand why everything that should have worked didn't." Renata read that paragraph twice. Then she sat very still. There was a woman she had spent a significant portion of her adult life not thinking about directly. Her mother, Vera Kowalski, born in Lorain, Ohio, raised in a part of it that didn't appear in travel guides, who had cleaned other people's houses for 32 years and taken the bus to do it regardless of weather, who had worked holidays and covered for sick colleagues and kept meticulous notes about each family's preferences because Vera Kowalski believed that doing a job meant doing it completely. Who had given Renata literally everything, the clothing, the application fees. The first semester's tuition, scraped from a savings account that must have taken years to build, handed over without ceremony, without conditions, without anything except the quiet certainty that her daughter was going somewhere and deserved the resources to get there. Renata had gotten there. She had gotten so far there that she had, somewhere in the journey, stopped being able to look directly at where she'd started. Not from shame, she had always told herself. From pragmatism, you go forward, not back. You build, not remember, you become. She had become. She looked at her hands, the manicure, the ring that had cost more than her mother had made in 2 years. the silk sleeve of a dressing gown that Renata had selected carefully because it signaled to anyone who knew what to look for exactly the right things about exactly the right life. She thought about a man in a navy suit crouching on a ballroom floor. She had been 6 feet away. She had seen it, had registered it, had processed it through her standard filter and filed it under doesn't understand the room and moved on. She had been looking for Douglas at the time, or looking for someone worth talking to, or looking for the next thing that needed managing. She had not stopped, she had looked away, and she had not, until this moment, sitting in this study with this transcript open on her laptop, fully looked at what that meant. She had looked away from a man helping an old woman pick up glass, because it had seemed like the behavior of someone who didn't know where they were or what was expected of them. And the man in question had turned out to know exactly where he was, and she had turned out to be the one who didn't know what was expected. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Douglas, from downstairs. Gerald says we need to go to him directly, in person. Today. She looked at the message for a long moment, then she typed back, I know. She closed the laptop. Took off her reading glasses, sat another moment in the quiet study, while the implications of the morning assembled themselves into something she could look at directly. Then she got up, went to get dressed, because some reckonings you go toward. Even when every instinct you've spent 30 years building tells you to manage the situation from a safe distance instead. Hale residence, Beacon Hill, 12:40 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. Loisur. Doiten every meridian fund, thang Harlow institutional equity. Then Brid Douglas to Kogoi Dorothea sang part 3. Suosongai taika ko thang wenti kaingai nyat guan. The call from Savannah came through at 12:40. Douglas was in the kitchen. The study had gone too quiet, which made his own thoughts too loud, and the kitchen at least had the ambient hum of the city outside to fill some of the silence. He had made 4 calls that morning. 3 had gone to voicemail. 1 had connected and then been worse than voicemail. Area code 912, his mother, Dorothea Hale, 76 years old, living alone in the house on Gaston Street in Savannah that she had refused to leave after Douglas's father died, on the grounds that she had lived there for 41 years and did not intend to let grief rearrange her geography. She had, over the course of Douglas's life, developed an instinct for the moments when he most needed to hear from her that bordered on something he could not explain rationally. He answered, Mom, I saw it. No greeting. Dorothea had concluded some years ago that openings were a waste of the time that was actually available. Marjorie's granddaughter sent it to her. Marjorie called me. Mom, there's a great deal of context that, Douglas, her voice. The specific register that had nothing to do with anger. Anger would have been easier, and everything to do with something older and more durable. The voice of a woman who had known him since before he knew himself, and had never once confused who he was with, who he was performing. Do you remember what I told you about your grandfather? He remembered. He had always remembered. Edmund Hale, who had worked as a porter for 21 years, who had carried other people's luggage through lobbies that were not designed to see him, who had done it with a dignity so complete it had apparently required no external confirmation to sustain itself. Your father saw what that cost Granddad, Dorothea said. Not the work. The work was honest work and your grandfather was proud of it. But the being looked through, the way certain people communicated without a single specific word, that Edmund was useful but not quite. She paused. Let the unfinished sentence be the sentence. Your father told me once it was the thing he was most ashamed of witnessing. That he had seen it happen and had not known then how to make it stop. Douglas said nothing. He made me a promise, Dorothea said, after we were married, after he had his own money, after the rooms started organizing themselves around him instead of looking through him. He promised me he would never make another person feel the way Edmund had been made to feel. She paused. He kept it for a while, and then the years went by, and the company grew, and keeping promises got more complicated than he'd expected. And he forgot. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not calling to make you feel worse, she said. You already feel worse. I can hear it in your voice, and I've known your voice for 52 years. I'm calling because I need you to understand something before you go fix this. A breath, and you are going to go fix this, Douglas, because you are my son and I did not raise you to let things stay broken that your hands can reach. I know, Mom. The problem is not the clip, she said. The problem is not the stock price or the board resignations or whatever Gerald Finch is telling you to say in your statement. The problem is that you looked at a man last night, a stranger, a man you knew nothing about, and you decided in the space of a few seconds that he was worth less than the room. She paused. That decision didn't come from nowhere. That came from years of small decisions that nobody made you account for, including me. Another pause. I'm accounting for it now. Douglas closed his eyes. Fixing last night, Dorothea said. Without fixing what produced last night, that's painting over rot. Your father did that. I watched him do it. I'm asking you not to. Okay, Mom, Douglas said. His voice came out differently than he'd expected. The way things come out differently when the performance has finally run out of material. Okay, Dorothea said. Go. And Douglas. A final pause, the particular quality of a woman selecting her last word carefully. Go as yourself, not as whoever you've been in that building. She hung up. Douglas sat with the phone in his hand until the screen went dark. He looked at his reflection in it, small, darkened, the reflection of a man sitting in an immaculate kitchen that someone else kept immaculate, and who had never, not once, thought about what that said about him. He thought about his grandfather, Edmund Hale, carrying bags, smiling at people who did not smile back because they had decided, without thinking about it very hard, that the man carrying their bags was a function rather than a person. And Edmund, according to every story Dorothea had ever told, carrying himself through all of it with the unshakable quality of someone who had decided, long before Douglas was born, that other people's estimations of him were simply not his responsibility to manage. Douglas had always admired that story. He had never, until this moment in this kitchen, considered what it meant that he had become one of the people in it. The thought sat with him. He let it. Because Dorothea had said go as yourself, and he needed to know, before he walked out this door, which self he was going as. Not the polished version, not the version that had walked into a ballroom last night with a wife in a gold dress and $750 million about to happen. The self underneath that, the one his mother had raised, the one Edmund had in some indirect but real way shaped. He sat with it for 11 minutes. Then he stood up, went to the foot of the stairs. Renata, a pause. Then her voice, already steady in the way it got when she had made a decision. I'm ready. He picked up his coat. They left the house at 1:15 p.m. The drive was 22 minutes. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the things that needed saying required the room they were going to, not the car. Renata looked out the passenger window. Douglas drove. The city moved around them in its standard indifference, offering no opinions on any of it. At 2 p.m., Nina put the call through. Mr. Mercer, she said through the intercom, there are a Douglas and Renata Hale in the lobby. No appointment. They said they'll wait. Calvin looked up from the org chart. How long have they been there? 43 minutes, sir. He considered that. 43 minutes with no appointment and no certainty of being received. Not the behavior of people who had come to negotiate. The behavior of people who understood they had no negotiating position left and had come anyway. Tell them I'll be down in 10 minutes, he said. Yes, sir. He set the org chart aside, put on his jacket, rode the elevator down. The lobby was marble and the quiet efficiency of a building that worked. Douglas stood near the entrance, coat still on. He looked like a man who had been performing a version of himself since 6 in the morning and had run completely out of the resources for it. Not broken, but stripped, which was different. Stripped, in Calvin's experience, was the more useful condition. Renata stood slightly apart from him. Not distantly, in her own space with her own thoughts, which told Calvin something important. She had not come here only as Douglas's support structure. She had come here as herself, with her own things to account for. Calvin stopped a few feet from them. He looked at Douglas, then Renata. Mr. Mercer, Douglas said. The voice that was left after the polish ran out. We're here because I know why you're here, Calvin said. Not unkindly. Just clearly Douglas stopped. There's a conference room on the 4th floor, Calvin said. Follow me. He turned and walked to the elevator. Behind him, Douglas exhaled, the specific exhale of a man who had braced for a wall and found a door instead. And Renata said something quiet to Douglas, and Douglas answered in a register too low to catch. The elevator opened. Calvin stepped in. They followed. 3 people, 4 floors up, mirrored walls and the soft hum of the mechanism. Not a word between them. because some conversations are too important for hallways, and the room was waiting. Conference room 4B, Crestline Capital Offices, 2:15 p.m. to 3:40 p.m. Lois Sua, then beat Douglas to cuộc gọi Dorothea. Thêm khoảnh khắc Calvin quyết định không kể lịch sử 37 nàng. Sir Douglas nói câu có chiều sâu quá đột ngột. The conference room had one long table, 6 chairs, a window facing north where the city arranged itself under November light, gray and complete and indifferent to everything happening inside this room. Calvin sat on one side, Douglas and Renata on the other. No lawyers, no buffer of professional distance. Just 3 people and a table and the specific quality of silence that lives in the space before something true gets said. Not comfortable, not hostile, just present. Heavy with what it was waiting for. Prescott had left a water pitcher, 3 glasses, small curtsies that say this is still a civilized conversation, whatever else it is. Douglas poured water for himself. Then, a beat late, the beat of a man whose instincts were fighting their way through everything else occupying him, he poured for Renata. Then he looked at Calvin's glasses. He poured that one too, Calvin noticed. Filed it. Said nothing. Douglas set the pitcher down. He looked at his hands for a long moment. The hands of a man looking for a beginning that doesn't sound like management. Then he looked up. His mother had said, "Go as yourself." This was him trying. "I've been thinking since last night about what to say to you," he said. "I prepared things in the car. None of them were right." He stopped. Started again at the place below the preparation. "We were wrong. What I did was wrong, not because of what it cost us. I understand what it cost us, and I'm not here about that. Because of what it was, what it communicated to a person who was standing in a room." He stopped again. He pressed his lips together. "That's what my mother said to me this morning, that what I did communicated something. And she was right." Calvin looked at him, not warm, not punishing, clear. "Okay," he said. Douglas blinked. "Had prepared for more. I heard you," Calvin said. He reached forward, turned the laptop toward them, opened it to page 47, did not speak. Let the page do what pages do when they are allowed to. Douglas looked at the screen. The color left his face in stages, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual way of someone who is reading something and understanding, sentence by sentence, the full shape of what they're reading. "How long?" Douglas said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks before the gala, before the handshakes, before the wine. "You knew," Douglas said. "I knew. Then why come at all?" "The audit tells me what the company did," Calvin said. "It doesn't tell me who the people running it are. I've learned not to conflate those two things." A pause that had no cruelty in it. "Just wait. I came to see for myself." "You answered the question I was asking." Silence. There was a moment. Calvin felt it distinctly, the way you feel moments that contain a choice, where he could have said more. Where he could have told Douglas that he was not the first person to find this architecture inside this company. That 15 years ago, a 26-year-old employee had documented the same structure and handed it to management in a binder and been walked out the door with a cardboard box. That the man sitting across this table was, in ways neither of them had chosen, the continuation of a story that had started before either of them had known each other existed. He could have said all of that. He chose not to, not because it wasn't true, because it was his story, and this room was not about his story. His story had already produced its result. The filing that would go through at 4:30, the audit that was already in motion, the org chart with 2,300 names that he was going to spend the rest of this week figuring out how to protect. His story had done its work. What this room needed was Douglas's story, and Douglas's story needed room. So Calvin stayed quiet. And let page 47 be enough. Renata had not spoken. She was reading, not skimming, reading, her eyes moving with the concentrated attention of someone who processes before reacting, because she has learned over a long time that reacting before processing is how you lose. She read for nearly 4 minutes. No one spoke. The city was audible through the glass. A distant siren, traffic in its continuous low register, the ordinary sounds of a world that kept moving. Renata looked up. "It's the same structure," she said. Douglas turned to her. "What?" "The accounting methodology." She pointed at the screen without touching it. "Precise. The offshore buffer arrangement, the liability reclassification, the quarterly projection inflation. I researched Hargrove Financial this morning." She looked at Douglas directly. Her voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the control is costing something. "This is identical. Not similar, identical. The same routing logic, the same categorization approach. She stopped, then said it plainly. Did you know? The room changed, not loudly, the way temperature changes. You feel it before you can name it. Douglas was quiet. Douglas. Her voice broke on the second syllable, just slightly, just enough to make it real. Did you know that what you inherited was the same structure that triggered the SEC investigation? That cost 11 people their careers. Did you know it was the same? I inherited it, Douglas said, low. The voice of someone who has been running from a specific answer for a specific number of years and has just reached the end of the road. I told myself the restructuring had addressed it. I looked at the new name on the building and I told myself it was different. I needed it to be different. He paused, so I decided it was. You decided, Renata said, not cruel. Exact. Yes, Douglas said. The single word cost him something visible. Renata turned back to Calvin and something in her posture changed, not collapsed, something more deliberate. The specific movement of a person abandoning a position they have been defending for a very long time, not because they've been defeated, because they've decided to stop. Mr. Mercer, she said, I need to say something, not about the deal. I understand the deal is finished. Not about the business consequences. Those are ours to live with. She paused, searching for the right beginning, which is different from searching for the right words. I read something this morning, a transcript of a talk you gave. In 2019, Calvin was very still. You said the most expensive thing a company can do is make its people feel like furniture. She looked at the table surface briefly, then back at him. I haven't been able to get that sentence out of my head. She paused, and then she said the thing that had been building all morning, since she had sat in the study with the laptop and looked at her hands and understood something she had been successfully avoiding for a very long time. My mother cleaned houses, she said. 4 words. The kind of sentence that costs something when you say it to a stranger. Especially when you have spent 30 years arranging your life so it would never need to be said. In Lorain, Ohio. For 32 years. She was thorough and she was reliable and she cared about doing it well. Not because anyone noticed, but because that was who she was. Renata's hands were flat on the table, completely still. The women she worked for were mostly decent, but there were moments. Small ones, the tone of voice. The assumption in the way someone opened a door or didn't. The way a person can communicate without a single specific word that you are useful but not quite. She stopped. The unfinished word sat in the room. I watched it happen, Renata said, and I understood even as a child what it meant. And I swore in the way that children swear things that I would never be the person on that side of it. She looked at her hands, the ring, the silk sleeve. I became that person anyway. She said it plainly. Without self-pity, without theater. Just the declarative fact of it, the way you say something once you've stopped trying to argue yourself out of it. Last night I was 6 feet away when you helped that woman pick up the broken glass. I saw it. I registered it, I processed it through. She stopped. I thought you didn't understand the room. She looked at him directly. I was the one who didn't understand the room. I spent 30 years becoming someone that no room would look through. And last night I became the person doing the looking through. I became the voice my mother heard in other people's houses. A pause. I became the person who made her life harder. The conference room was absolutely silent. Douglas was looking at his wife with an expression Calvin had not anticipated and could not entirely name. It was the look of a man seeing something that had been present for a very long time, and that he was only now, in this room, in this specific quality of honesty, able to fully recognize. Calvin took a slow breath. That, he said, is the first honest thing I've heard from either of you. Not absolution. Not warmth. The acknowledgement that something real had been said into a room that could hear it. Renata nodded once. The deal is finished, Calvin said, even, settled. That doesn't change. He looked at Douglas, and the accounting structure will be reported to the SEC. That doesn't change either. The obligation existed from the moment the audit was complete. What happened last night didn't create it. It removed the last reason I had to take more time before moving. He paused. What you can do, what you owe to the people in your organization who never made any of the decisions on page 47, is cooperate fully with everything that follows. Give the regulators everything they ask for. Don't make those people pay for your legal strategy. Douglas looked at him. He then said, yes, one word, and it cost him something. which meant it was worth something. Calvin stood. The meeting was over. Not because everything was resolved, most of it wasn't, but because everything this room could hold had been put in it. Lobby and elevator, and following weeks 3:40 p.m. onward Loy Sua, them 3-4 Kove Renata Saukogup. Sua the ordinary sounds of Len 2. Calvin walked them to the elevator himself, the small courtesy of it, not warmth. Warmth was not what this was, and pretending otherwise would have cheapened both the conversation they'd just had and the people who'd had it. But decency, the basic human decency of seeing people to the door, which did not require that you approve of them. Which was in fact only decency when it didn't require approval. His grandfather had understood that. At the elevator, Renata turned. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has decided there is no longer any point in managing how she is perceived, because the management is part of what produced last night. Mr. Mercer, she said, I'm sorry. Not for the business outcome that's ours to live with. I'm sorry for what we did to you in that room. In front of all those people, she stopped. You deserved better than that. Not because of who you are or what you own. Because you were a person standing in a room. Calvin looked at her for a moment. So did your mother, he said quietly. Every single day, in every house she walked into, the elevator opened, Renata stepped in. And Renata Hale, who had spent 30 years building walls of such precision that almost nothing had gotten through them, who had walked into this building 2 hours ago, still half believing there was a version of this situation that could be managed, looked at the floor of the elevator and said nothing at all. Because there was nothing to say to that. Because it was true in the complete way that true things are. Not partially, not with qualifications, not open to the reinterpretation that she had, over a long career, learned to apply to most things. Just true, completely. The doors closed. Calvin stood in the hallway. The building hummed around him. Someone laughing in an office down the corridor. A phone ringing twice and stopping. The afternoon doing what afternoons do. He stood another moment. Then he went back upstairs. In the weeks that followed, Renata Hale did something that people who had known her for years would later describe as out of character, which meant they had not known her as well as they thought. She withdrew from her 3 board advisory positions, 2 non-profits, 1 trade organization, without statements, without the elaborate explanatory architecture that usually accompanied her exits from public-facing roles. She simply stepped back and she called her mother, not to explain, not to confess, just to call, the way she had stopped calling with any regularity sometime in the years when the building had demanded most of her attention. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring, in the slightly cautious way of a woman who has learned that unexpected calls sometimes carry unexpected weight. They talked for 40 minutes. Renata did not mention the gala or the clip or the conference room on the 4th floor. She asked about her mother's neighbors, about the garden, about whether the church's fall fundraiser had gone the way her mother had hoped. Small things, the kind of things that had always been there, waiting in the years when Renata had been too busy becoming someone else to call about them. Her mother did not ask what had prompted the call. She was, Renata understood, a woman who knew better than to question a good thing when it arrived. Crestline Capital Offices, 3:55 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. The SEC filing went through at 4:30 p.m., 114 pages. 41 exhibits. The full accounting structure of Apex Meridian Corporation, the offshore buffer arrangements, the liability reclassification methodology, the systematic inflation of quarterly projections, the specific authorization chain that made clear, beyond any reasonable interpretation, that these were not errors or oversights but decisions made by people with full access to their consequences. Calvin's legal team had been preparing it for 5 weeks. Every detail sourced, cross-referenced, verified. The kind of document that does not leave gaps because the people who built it understood that gaps were where the truth went to get lost, and they were not in the business of losing truth. Prescott brought the receipt confirmation to Calvin's desk at 4:47. Filed and received, he said. Time spent confirmed. Calvin looked at the confirmation page. Read it once, set it down. Good, he said. He meant it in the fullest sense of the word. Not good as relief, not good as satisfaction, good as the specific recognition that a thing which was right had been done, which was its own complete reward and required nothing added to it. Prescott hesitated. In 3 years, Calvin had come to understand Prescott's hesitations precisely. This particular one, the slight pause at the doorway, the breath held just slightly longer than normal, was the hesitation of a man who had a question he wasn't certain was within his professional scope to ask. Go ahead, Calvin said. The filing was always going to happen, Prescott said carefully. You had the obligation from the moment the audit was complete. Last night didn't create it. He paused. Did last night change anything about what you were going to do or when? Calvin considered this with the genuine attention it deserved. The filing was always coming, he said. The deal was always contingent on the audit being clean. Which it wasn't. He turned slightly toward the window, November light going amber at the edges as the afternoon moved toward evening. What last night changed was what I knew about the people, which is information, useful for decisions that are still ahead. The 3,000 employees, Prescott said. That's the question. You've been looking at the org chart since 2 o'clock. I know what I've been looking at. Prescott allowed a small silence. Then, what are you seeing? Calvin turned back from the window. He picked up the org chart. Looked at it the way he had been looking at it for the past 2 hours. Not at the structure, which he had already mapped completely, but at what the structure implied about where the damage was concentrated and where it wasn't. The irregularities on page 47 required specific authorization, he said, C-suite and senior partners. The accounting methodology was designed at that level and implemented through systems that the people below director grade didn't have access to and wouldn't have understood even if they did. He set the chart down. 2,300 people below director level had nothing to do with it. They showed up. They did the work. They kept the machine running. He paused. They didn't pour the wine. Prescott was quiet for a moment. Is there a path, he said. I've been trying to find one since last night. He had. Since the moment he had walked away from the Harrington Grand and thought 3,000 people and understood that the decision he had made, the right decision, the only decision available to him given what he knew, would have consequences that would land on people who deserved none of them. He had been trying to find a way to separate the consequences from the people. At 5:15, his desk phone rang. Nina's voice through the intercom. Harriet Cross calling Mr. Mercer. She says she's calling from Apex Meridian. Calvin straightened. Put her through. A click. Then a voice. Solid, a little weathered. The specific quality of timber that has been through weather and is more credible for it. Mr. Mercer, Harriet Cross said, I'm not calling about the deal. I want to be clear about that from the start. I know the deal is finished. Then what are you calling about? Calvin said. The people, she said. I've been looking at the organizational chart since this morning. The viable divisions, mid-market analytics, the compliance consulting arm, the regional advisory teams, those operations are sound. The people running them are capable. The irregularities were concentrated at the top and in the financial reporting structure. Below that, the work is real and the talent is genuine. A pause. Not for effect, for precision. 2,300 people whose jobs don't have to disappear because of decisions they didn't make. Calvin was very still. I'm proposing a bridge arrangement, Harriet continued. 60 days of payroll stabilization while we identify acquirers for the viable divisions. Not a rescue of Apex Meridian, an entity that ship has sailed and frankly it needed to sail. A rescue of the work and the people doing it. Another pause. I understand you may have reasons not to want to be involved in anything connected to this company going forward. I want you to know that I would understand that completely. Send me the numbers, Calvin said. A brief silence on her end. The silence of someone who had prepared for more resistance. I'll have them to you by 6, she said. Good. A pause. Mr. Mercer, Harriet said. The register changed slightly. Not less professional, but less formal. The difference between someone speaking to a counterpart and someone speaking to another person. Can I say something that isn't about the business? Go ahead. I've been in corporate governance for 31 years, she said. I have seen a very large number of people make a very large number of decisions. Most of them make decisions based on what they stand to receive. She paused. You're looking at an org chart of 2,300 people who don't know your name, who will never know what you're considering doing for them or why. And you're still considering it. Another pause. I don't have a frame for that fits comfortably into the work I usually do. I just wanted to say I noticed it. Calvin looked out the window. The city in the late afternoon, amber light on glass and stone. The particular beauty of a city at the end of a working day, when all of its motion takes on a quality that feels almost like intention. My mother worked nights, he said, cleaning a hospital, for 28 years. Every person in that hospital, the patients, the families, the doctors, the administrators, depended on the work she did. The building had to be clean, the rooms had to be prepared, the systems had to function. Without that work, none of the other work was possible. He paused. She mattered completely, absolutely. She just didn't always get to know it. A long silence from Harriet Cross. Then, I'll have the numbers to you by 6. Good, Calvin said. He hung up, sat for a moment. Then he picked up the org chart again and started marking it. Carefully, methodically, the way he did everything. Identifying the divisions, the teams, the specific clusters of work that could be separated cleanly from the structure that was going to fall. Finding the parts worth saving, finding the path. Because the path was there. It was always there, if you looked long enough and carefully enough, and were willing to do the work of finding it rather than declaring it didn't exist. At 6:02 the numbers arrived from Harriet Cross. He read them thoroughly, ran the analysis twice, checked the assumptions they were sound. He picked up the phone Boston various locations following weeks Loy Sua so ngai thang 29 ngai nat kwan. Tem chi tiat zai tik kwang chong 1517 ngai chuk hi bai bao Elaine dung, te the ordinary sounds of Len 3. Kat burt bangin ngui suong kon 3 len and tuan chuan. Apex Meridian Corporation filed for restructuring on a Tuesday. 29 days after the gala, which was measured against the company's actual internal condition, not particularly fast. The foundation had been compromised for years. The filing was not the cause of the collapse, it was the acknowledgement of one. The moment when a structure that had been quietly failing stopped performing soundness and simply became what it had been for a long time. Douglas resigned the CEO position the same morning. His statement ran 3 paragraphs, not a lawyer's 3 paragraphs, or not entirely. They had the specific quality of something that had started as a lawyer's draft and had been revised, several times, by a man who had decided that the only remaining currency he had was honesty, and who was trying, with the difficulty of someone learning late, to spend it well. The first paragraph acknowledged failures of leadership and judgment. The second committed to full cooperation with the SEC review. The third, the one that surprised careful readers, said something that did not sound like crisis management. He wrote, "The people of this organization deserved leadership that saw them clearly. I was not that. I intend to spend the time ahead understanding the difference between the leader I believed myself to be and the one I actually was, and what that cost people who had done nothing to deserve it." People who knew Douglas Hale read that paragraph and were surprised. People who knew Dorothea Hale were not. Harriet Cross was appointed interim CEO. She moved through the first week with the efficiency of someone who had been watching this situation develop for long enough to have already made most of the decisions she would need to make. She cleared the senior leadership, she contacted the viable divisions, she began identifying potential acquirers with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the goal was not to find a buyer for the entity. That ship had sailed, and frankly it needed to, but to find the right homes for the work that was worth saving. She called Calvin's office twice that week. Both calls were brief, specific, and productive. The bridge arrangement was in place. Payroll was stable. The first acquisition conversation for the mid-market analytics division was moving faster than projected. The people who came to work every day that week did not know the full shape of what was happening around them, which was normal. People worked inside structures being remade all the time without knowing it. The difference here was that someone was making sure the remaking did not require them to disappear. They didn't know that either. That was fine. Elaine Voss had spent the 17 days between the gala and her publication date doing what she had spent 31 years learning to do, verifying. Every source, every claim, every implication of every claim. She and Robert Gale had divided the reporting between them. He took the structural story, the corporate history, the documented pattern that his 2 years of prior work had given him the architecture to tell. She took the room itself, what had happened in it, what it meant, what it always meant every time it happened in every room where it happened. Her piece ran on a Thursday afternoon, 4,200 words, not the clip, not the caption. The piece that the clip had been pointing toward without knowing it, The one that required the 17 days and the 31 years and the 40 years of Robert Gale's reporting before it to exist. It was about rooms, about the invisible architecture of who is seen and who is not in the rooms where consequential things happen. About the accumulated weight of small decisions, the eye rolls, the finger snaps, the wine glasses tilted, and the large decisions those small ones produce over time. About the cost of all of it, paid not in dollars but in the currency of human dignity that appears on no balance sheet and damages no quarterly report and is real nonetheless. She did not name Calvin directly at his request. She named the pattern. The piece found its readers at the speed of something worth sitting with. Not viral speed, not 2 million views in 48 hours, but the steady, purposeful movement of writing that goes to the right places rather than everywhere at once. A woman in Louisville, 67 years old, who had spent 26 years in corporate environments and knew exactly what Elaine was describing, who set the piece down after the third paragraph and sat with it for a long time before picking it up again. A retired teacher in Phoenix who read it Sunday morning and thought about every student she had watched be made invisible and what it had cost them. A man in Cleveland who thought about his father and a career spent being the most capable person in rooms that were arranged so he couldn't say so. The piece did not go viral. It went somewhere better. It went deep. And Cecilia Burke, 63 years old, 11 years on the evening shift at the Harrington Grand, a daughter in Cincinnati and a grandson she FaceTimed on Sunday mornings, read it on her break 3 days after it published. She did not know that the journalist had been 6 feet away from her that night. She did not know about the man in the navy suit, not in any way that connected to her. She just knew that there was a line in the piece about a woman picking up glass alone while 200 people lifted their glasses over her head, and that the line described her so exactly, so quietly and completely and without drama, that she had to set her phone down for a moment before she could finish. She finished. She folded the screen dark. She sat in the break room for the remaining 4 minutes of her break, in the fluorescent quiet of a room designed for nothing except a brief pause in the middle of work, and she thought, someone saw that. That was all. That was, in fact, everything. 3 days later, her supervisor called her into the facilities office and told her about the scholarship. Anonymous funding, third-party administration, prioritized toward evening and overnight staff. First recipient identified by seniority and need. Cecilia sat in the small office and said, "I don't understand." Her supervisor said, "Someone saw you." "That's all I was told." Cecilia looked at her hands. "All right," she said. The way you say all right when you mean something the word isn't large enough to hold. When you mean, I have done this work for 11 years, and someone noticed, and I did not know until this moment how much I needed that to be true. All right, she said again, and it was. Baltimore, Maryland, a Saturday in December. Lois Sua Coquette Humlap Nguyen Van Coquette Part 1. Katbudwan Triatli the ordinary sounds. Sulan Tri Merita Zung Hingang Hakting Tai Vichitiet Azung Thailand Chuk. Calvin drove to Baltimore alone, not because he needed to. Prescott had offered a car and a driver. Calvin had said no thank you, same as always, and taken his own sedan, which was dark blue and looked like every other dark blue sedan on any highway, which was exactly why he drove it. He left early, the city thinning behind him as he went south, the skyline pulling back in the rear view until it was gone, then just a brightness at the edge of the cloud cover where the density of lit windows pushed against the gray. He drove in silence. He thought about Harriet Cross. The bridge was holding. The mid-market analytics acquisition would close before the new year. The compliance arm had a letter of intent. The regional teams were being absorbed individually. Slower, but cleaner, in the way that clean things are often slower. He thought about Renata in the elevator, the way she had looked at the floor and said nothing. The specific quality of that silence. Not emptiness, but fullness. The way silence is full when someone has just understood something they cannot yet speak around. He thought about Douglas's one-word yes across the conference table. What it had cost to say it simply. What it would cost, going forward, to mean it. He thought about a scholarship that would renew annually. About a woman in a break room who had read a piece of journalism and felt for a moment entirely seen. About the particular and irreplaceable value of being seen. Not famous, not celebrated, not put on any screen, just seen. By someone paying attention, he turned down Elamont Street, the row houses, the marble stoops, the corner store with its prop door. The elementary school playground, empty on a Saturday, the swings moving slightly in a wind that had come up while he was driving. He pulled up in front of the house, sat for a moment with the engine off. It was smaller than memory made it. It always was every time he came back. Not diminished by the smallness, just returned to its actual size, which was the size of the place where he had become whoever he was before the world had opinions about it. His grandfather had come home to this house every night for 31 years, not with stories about who had recognized him that day, or what the room had thought of him when he walked in, or whether the people he'd served had understood what they were in the presence of. Gerald Mercer had come home to this house and eaten dinner, and watched the news and gone to bed and done it again. Not because life had not asked more of him, because he had understood at some foundational level that Calvin had spent his whole adult life trying to describe to himself precisely that the asking was not the measure. The doing was the measure, the showing up was the measure. He got out of the car, stood on the sidewalk. The block moved around him in its Saturday way, a dog somewhere, kids on bikes at the far corner, a neighbor pulling groceries from a car 2 houses down. The specific rhythm of a neighborhood being entirely itself, without reference to anything outside it. He reached into his coat pocket. The Timex. He had taken it off that morning and put it in his pocket instead of on his wrist. Some instinct about this particular trip, about arriving at this particular place holding it rather than wearing it. He turned it in his palm, the metal cool, the leather strap worn smooth by 40 years of his grandfather's wrist and 15 of his own. The watch itself unchanged, telling the same time it had always told, not fast, not slow, exactly what it was. Gerald Mercer, who had shown up every day, who had been what he said he was, who had not needed a room to confirm it, or a number on a screen to prove it, or a logo spinning on a display to make it real. Who had understood long before Calvin had the words for it, that worth was not conferred, that you carried it. That the question was never whether you had it. The question was whether you remembered. When the rooms got grand enough that remembering felt unnecessary, or hard enough that remembering hurt, that you had it to begin with. Calvin stood on Elamont Street and felt the weight of that, not heavily, the way you feel something that has been true for a long time and that you have finally stopped carrying at arm's length. He walked up the front steps, put his hand flat on the door for a moment, just once, the way you touch something to complete a gesture that wants completing. Then he walked back down, got in the car, sat for a moment with the engine off and the December quiet surrounding everything and nothing requiring his attention for the next few minutes except this. He fastened the Timex around his wrist, left hand, 2 fingers of space, the way Gerald had shown him. Then he started the car. Pulled away from the curb, Elamont Street in the rear view. Smaller, then gone, then the kind of present that doesn't need to be visible to remain real. The highway opened ahead, long and gray, full of people going ordinary places on an ordinary Saturday, each of them carrying whatever they carried through the invisible labor of being a person in the world, which was the oldest work there was, and the least acknowledged, and the most essential. The city rebuilt itself in the windshield as he drove toward it. Calvin Mercer drove back into it, the same way he always had. The Timex said 11:52. He had left early. He was returning exactly when he'd intended. Which was, when he thought about it, the only kind of punctuality that had ever mattered. Not the punctuality of clocks, but the punctuality of a life that arrived, consistently, at the things it had promised itself it would. Gerald Mercer had understood that now, finally and completely. So did he.